This is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for the Polis Project's Dispatches series. The video you saw right now is an incomplete and ongoing list of political prisoners in India. Joining us today is Professor Romila Thapar. How does one introduce a figure like Professor Thapar, whose public life work spans over 70 years? She's a renowned historian and author, and one of India's leading public intellectuals. I have decided that unlike the JNU administration that demanded that Professor Thapar submit his CV, I'm going to entirely skip that exercise. If I mentioned the long list of her publications, prestigious fellowships, awards, the leading institutions in India and around the world she has taught, we'll be here for quite a while. Instead, I'm going to introduce her as a fierce critic and a dissenting citizen of the Socialist Secular Democratic Republic of India, and she's here today to discuss her new book, Voices of Dissent. Professor Thapar, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We are living in extraordinary times, so I'm going to start by asking you how you're doing.
Well, I can, first of all, thank you for inviting me to do this interview. How am I doing? I can only give the reply that I normally give, which is so far so good. Who knows about tomorrow? And I must confess that I've never felt so much uncertainty from day to day. There is, of course, the pandemic and the precautions that one has to take. But there are other global semi-pandemics which worry me a great deal. There's an imminent economic collapse coming along in many parts of the world. There is a trashing of democracy going on in many parts of the world, with people asking questions like, should we reconsider the whole enterprise of democratic living? And there's the damage to the environment, which seems to be unstoppable. And so one often wonders, have all these problems just come together as a collection, or have we always had them and have managed to ignore some of the strains and concentrate on others? How does one cope with this? I really don't know. I wake up in the morning and I reach for the newspaper, and halfway through I ask myself, as we're all doing these days, is this fake news or is it for real? There's a problem even with something like that. There are contradictions that come. One day you're told one thing, the next day you're told something else. And then, horror of horrors, the sensationalism with which everything is wrapped. I really don't know. I thought I would sort it out in the 6 months of being in self-isolation, but I haven't been able to do a thing.
So let's get to the conversation and get it started. In 1979, you gave the M.N. Roy Memorial Lecture, and the topic that you chose was dissent in early Indian tradition. This is a two-part question. First, would it be right to say that dissent is something that has preoccupied you for a long time, perhaps your entire academic career? And in that case, can you tell us what has shaped your political, philosophical, and historical interest in the ideas of dissent?
No, dissent has not been my overwhelming interest. And I guess part of my problem has been that I've had more than one substantial interest in the Indian past. And so I get drawn in different directions. But it started off, the interest in dissent started off with my doing a lot of reading on the mid-first millennium BCE, where I was interested in the rise of ideologies and religions like Buddhism and Jainism, and the thinking of the Arjivak groups and the Charvaks, very different from Vedic Brahmanism of the first millennium. It was a highly creative period, philosophically the most exciting period, I think, that we have known. And so the question that kept bothering me was that through all this discussion that went on, the one thing that emerged on the landscape was the renouncer, what we call the Buddhist bhikshu, and other people like that, who becomes a very important figure on the Indian landscape. The renouncer is someone who opts out of society, but remains in the sense that he has links with society and very often becomes a figure of authority. And this seemed to me a kind of strange contradiction, that someone who opts out of society then becomes a figure of authority in society. And it's something that needs to be addressed. Renunciation had a religious and philosophical motivation, but it also produced a very important institution, which was established in virtually everywhere where there was a settlement. I'm referring to the monastery, a social institution, dependent on patronage and therefore on society, but closely linked again with people. Did this institution then enable the renouncer to additionally speak not only of the dharma and the religion, but of social ethics, to talk about social ethics, to talk about dissent, and to talk about social ethics and as an element which requires to be pursued through discussion and questioning. The question, therefore, was whether opting out of society was a mode of dissent. And this really led me into the very interesting areas of trying to analyze what is meant by dissent. What is the meaning of counterculture? Remember in the 1970s, when I first wrote about it, counterculture was a catchphrase. Is it suggestive of that kind of thinking? How does one set up an alternative society and convince people that the solution to one's well-being is not to go into isolation and become an ascetic, but even if one renounces, one becomes a part of society through this institution. But there is a distinction between a renouncer and ascetic, and the ascetic, and the two should not be confused. But this pattern of thinking, the kinds of questions that were being asked, is common to what we call the Shramanic religions, Buddhism, Jainism. Some people would include the Ajivakas as well, from the earliest times. I was interested in the social functioning of the monastery, where it becomes an institution that has a relationship with society. And the question then is that does its teaching effectively change society if it is, in fact, something of a counterculture? When it becomes a powerful institution, does this influence the organization of other competitive religions? Is there an attempt to imitate this institution? Or does it remain characteristic of the Shramana religions? And are the forms and contents of dissenting ideas and actions continued into later centuries, even by other sects and other belief systems? So I was looking at dissent, but I realized that it touched a whole range of activities. And maybe I should have just stayed with that and gone on and done more work on the subject, but I was drawn away.
It's been 40 years since the Roy Memorial Lecture, and your recent book and these two texts were written in two very different times. What would you say has changed, and what would you say has remained since?
Well, I was very conscious of the context, as all historians are when they're writing their history. They're choosing what to write on and to write history. If one argues, as many historians do, that the historian's perspective is conditioned by the period that she's living in, quite a legitimate argument, then this 40-year difference has to be inquired into. For the earlier period, it was really more a kind of intellectual interest, a curiosity. Dissent was being discussed. in contemporary times at that time. And it was conceded, in fact, that the right to non-violent dissenting views was part of democratic functioning. And this was also part of, one was part of a democracy, one was struggling with ideas of democracy, and therefore one is looking at dissent in those terms. In other words, I was trying to search for the roots of this idea that emphasized non-violent dissenting views. In current times, discussing opinions on a variety of subjects have tended to be marginalized, to put it politely. Some topics are better not discussed because we're told they tend to be misunderstood. There is a fear then of being hauled up for anti-national activities, as many people have been. Some do speak out somewhat tentatively. But speaking of dissent today is inevitably tied into the centrality of dissent in the anti-colonial movement, where dissent in anti-colonial nationalism was a very important aspect. And that again partly drew me to that, perhaps for personal reasons, because after all, I was a teenager at the time of the peak of the national movement. And I do regard myself very much as a product of those times.
You say that in any sophisticated society, there has to be a range of opinions and acts of dissent. Your recent book, Voices of Dissent, starts with the Brahmanas and Sharmanas. You've already made reference to them, who did not accept Vedic Brahmanism. Can you tell us how these ideas, early ideas of protest, dissent, and heresy, developed and evolved through ages?
That's a very big question, which requires a long answer, so I'll try and be brief. Dissent is always to be seen in relation to the society from which it emerges. It doesn't exist in abstract. It comes from the space and time in which it is rooted and to which it is linked. The ideas of and the sects associated with these ideas expand in numbers as time goes on. And when there is an expansion, there is a hierarchy of importance that also emerges. So the picture gets more and more complicated through the centuries. But let me try and simplify it by speaking of major turning points. We begin with the dichotomy, as it were, between Vedic Brahmanism and the Shramanic religions, the middle of the first millennium BCE. And for the Brahman, the Shramana, the follower of these Buddhist, Jain, Ajivic sects, is always described as a Nastika, a non-believer. So there is a sharp differentiation right at that point. The culture of the Shramanas, the non-believers, is widespread to begin with in the post-Mauryan period, but it begins to decline in the post-Gupta period, that is from the 6th, 7th centuries AD onwards. And patronage gradually shifts to institutions that were linked to what had emerged as something that some of us at least, call Puranic Hinduism, because the focus is on the worship of either Shiva or Vishnu or both, and the Shakti cults. This form is not the same as Vedic Brahmanism. So some people have argued that it might have been influenced here and there by the Shramanic religions. This is where dissent comes in and becomes a little bit of an influence and changes the existing orthodox religions. It differs because the major gods are different. The worship of icons is not part of Vedic Brahmanism. The location of the worship is now in temples, which are new to the idea. And the economy of the pilgrimage becomes extremely important, which wasn't the case earlier. But nevertheless, both of these groups have their established centers. They are commonly identified by sects because each group, as it grows, tends to splinter into sects. And there are a few dissenting sects as well. So you have this great complexity of people who are called the believers and the people who are called the non-believers and the different kind of sects into which they establish themselves. Now, what happens in the second millennium AD, what is called the Common Era, is that a different kind of dissent comes in. Partially dissent, partially not dissent, and rather mixed, as of course it has always been. And this is what we call Bhakti or devotional Hinduism. It's different because the worshipper can choose a deity whom he chooses to worship. He can choose the form of worship. The object of worship can be abstract or can be an icon. And the form of worship, again, is very often in hymns of praise. What is interesting about this change now, which existed with the dissenting groups but didn't exist in Vedic Brahmanism or in Puranic Hinduism, is that the worshippers can be from any social strata in Bhakti. Gender, any religion. So you have Ravidas, who was what today would be called a Dalit, and had a magnificent following in different parts of northern India. You have Mirabai, who comes out of a Rajput background and is much chastised for not behaving like an ideal Rajput woman when she breaks away and goes off on her own. And then you also have a category of Muslims who are Krishna Bhakts, Ras Khan being a major focus. These are well-established people who come from good backgrounds, hold high status jobs in the Mughal Empire, but who declare themselves to be Krishna Bhakts and write the most magnificent poetry in praise of this bhakti. So that it's a much more open situation where you don't have a sharp distinction between these are the people who are the dissenters against a particular ideology. But nevertheless, they're the kind of people that are not approved of to begin with by the orthodoxy, neither the Brahmin orthodoxy nor by the Muslim orthodoxy, because the Muslims who are breaking away are also going against the tenets of Islam. But it's that opening up of society and the opening up of religious ideas, which is so magnificent during this period of, especially the 16th century and onwards. And some of these bhakti sects, not all, but some, tend to continue the tradition of the earlier alternate society, where you do have a considerable freedom of religious expression. Now, I'm emphasizing religious expression for the simple reason that it is the easiest kind of enterprise to trace from the texts of the ancient times, because we don't have great treatises on political theory and on individual freedoms and things like that. But the idiom of religion, in a sense, is an idiom that we have to look at and examine much more from the point of view of what it is saying beyond just what it is saying about religion. And this is something which people are hesitant to do, but it's beginning now. And as social institutions, the sects, the bhakti sects, they relied again, as did the monasteries of old, on patronage, on asserting their status, and of course, having discussions on theology. Now, this tradition, which is in some ways a continuation, in some ways a disjuncture, is changed to a different definition in the colonial period. The colonial definition, they don't know what to do with a religion that they're unfamiliar with, in fact, a religious situation in the subcontinent of many religious sects, and they can't quite understand how they all fit together. So there is a tendency to try and bunch people together into monolithic religions. Now, monolithic religions are something that really become visible in the colonial period. And these are the religions that we are now accepting and living with and calling our own. So we must be aware of the historical point at which the history of religion changed. And this is not typical of India, it's typical of every part of the world where there have been major religious articulations. So in the 19th century, what do you have? You have the reform movements, the Samajas, the Brahmo Samaj, the Prarthana Samaj, the Arya Samaj, Sanatan Dharma. They are registering the aspirations of the middle class to a social presence. And they're partially dissident because they reformulate the religion. And they include in this reformulation a political agenda because they tend to link up with the national movement. And this is where the whole question of using the religious idiom for a political agenda begins and is carried forward in other forms. The other major form, and actually the only form in which it is carried forward in a major way, is 20th century Hindutva, which is taking from the colonial tradition. It's another reformulation of Hinduism, draws on the colonial formulations, defines the Hindu by ancestry and territory, and tries to integrate all Hindu sects into a monolithic religion. Why is it doing this? Beyond what was done by the colonial regime. And one can only explain it by the fact that it then facilitates the use of religion for a political agenda. And to integrate the majority Hindu community in a state where they're primary citizens and superior citizens. That is the function of Hindutva, it seems to me.
And that kind of brings us to this other question that I have for you, which is, you write that what we often overlook is that non-Muslims did not generally refer to Muslims by single label of Muslims as we do today. In those days, a reference to them in Sanskrit and other languages were based on different categories of names. Yet these labels were ethnic and not religious. How did these labels, solidified labels of Hindu and Muslim as these uniform, monolithic, and religious identities emerge?
Hindu is initially a geographical label. It's used to refer to all those people who lived in Al-Hind, which is a territory across the Indus as seen from West Asia. The Indus, which was then called Sindhu, and which is then in Persian called Hindush, and therefore this becomes Al-Hind, the people who live across the Indus. And it gradually came to be applied over the centuries to those who were not Muslims. And the references and applications begin around about the 15th century. Prior to that, the term is very often a term that is used for people and not for a religion. Now, the Sanskrit texts differentiate between the caste Hindus and the other groups that they called Nastika. They're going back to the old term that they used for the Shramanas, non-believers. It's interesting that it's the Hindus who are referring to the others as non-believers. That included, the term included the Shramans, the Buddhists and the Jains, and what they called Turushka. Now, Turushka was a term commonly used for the Muslims. And these were those that came from Central Asia, because Turushka is linked to Turks. And they are then bundled together, not only called non-believers, but they're also given the very low status of Mlech. They're low-born, they belong to a different culture, they speak a different language. What is interesting is that it's not just the Muslims, but it's also including the Buddhists and the Jains and all the others who are not followers of caste Hindu beliefs. The colonial perspective is projected onto Indian society, and the colonial perspective immediately talks about India consisted of two nations, the Hindus and the Muslims. And this crystallizes the notion of the monolithic religions being the basis of these two identities. They defined the Hindus, as did everyone else, as being everyone except the Muslims and the Christians and the Parsis. They were left out. Everybody else was bundled in together and called the Hindus. Now, earlier, we'd had a situation of great flexibility with sects that were sort of negotiating, conflicting, facing each other. Some were dissidents, some were part of the orthodoxy, but it was a kind of a mix of relationships of different kinds. This is all now being sorted out into these monolithic religious units. It is again the root of religion as we see it today. And this is, of course, set out in James Mill's History of British India, where he talks about these two nations that were constantly in conflict, the Hindus and the Muslims. So what I'm trying to suggest is that we don't recognize that there was once a different kind of religion. And its power lay in that it no longer is presented, the power that it had as a different kind of religion and these different sects that in relationship to each other, that is not recognized today. The only thing that is recognized is the monolithic religion. And I think to that extent, we have to do a lot of rethinking, re-examination, re-understanding of what the texts are telling us, which we don't listen to. We only listen to what the colonial interpretation is telling us.
This book traces various traditions of dissent in ancient India by focusing on non-violent forms. Was leaving out forms of resistance that include violence a specific choice? And I want to place this question in context. I ask this as someone who is deeply affected by the recent violence that was unleashed in Delhi. Violence is often willingly and disproportionately used against dissenting communities that are also marginalized. Of course, King very famously said, riot is the language of the unheard. And of course, this summer in New York, I saw the righteous anger play out on the streets. So that's the context of where my question is coming from. So was leaving out forms of resistance that include violence a very specific choice in this book?
No, not at all. Not at all. You must understand, as I finally understood, dissent is of various kinds. And my choice was really to try and understand one aspect of dissent, which was not what we generally associate. You dissent and you take to violent forms of protest. No, this was dissent of a different kind that I was talking about. And it's very necessary to recognize this because it is in some ways a quieter, more subtle form of dissent, but it is there. Therefore, people tend not to recognize it. And they say, oh, no, there wasn't there. There was no dissent. It was all harmonious. But in fact, it was there. And I think it's very necessary that we do. My definition of dissent did not include the use of violence because I was concerned with the category and the ideology of renunciation, of the Bhakti Sant, who's also a similar kind of person. And these are categories for whom violence was not a legitimate form of dissent. And I am looking at dissent which doesn't necessarily take to violence. It may eventually become that, but it doesn't initially. And I'm trying to understand what role that dissent played in constructing culture and society. If it is not as if there was no violence between the sects. When I talk about the sects and the distribution of the sects, there was immense violence sometimes, and this is recorded in the text, and we know it. We don't talk about it too often because we're still obsessed with this notion that ancient India was a society of total tolerance and harmony. But no, there was a lot of dissent. But the dissent did not lie in its being articulated through violence. There were other methods of articulating it. And it is these that I was interested in. Countering the views. How were views countered? Why were they countered? And this may in part explain the emphasis, or the great emphasis in the text, on holding public debates. Every court of any standing would hold public debates where questions were raised and answers were given. In theory, at least, for the Shramanas and to many of the Bhakti sons, if dissent turned violent, then the violence would tend to negate the dissent. And I'm very interested in this whole question of a kind of dissent which is quite deliberately not turning to violence, which I think is very important and yet is legitimately dissent.
You talk about history as a way to create an identity. Do you think it's possible now, at this historical moment in India, to fashion a new Indian identity as a history of protest? Would you say that perhaps the Shaheen Bagh protests as an example of such a refashioning?
History creates many identities. This is a problem that we historians have, sorting out these identities. And political organizations based on a large single identity end up as majoritarian organizations. They defeat their purpose. And they often try to manipulate history in order to legitimize that single identity. This is ahistorical. But I don't think that the Indian identity can be based only on a history of protest. I think the importance of the protest is that it questions, challenges, redefines the identities that are being put forward. And I think that's extremely important, that these identities have to be continually redefined and questioned. Because obviously identities change over history. And the protest has to be therefore analyzed historically, which we're beginning to do a little bit with the protests of the national movement, but we haven't done enough with contemporary protests. The same kind of protest differs in different contexts. We haven't had too many revolts in the past, some. We've had more migrations. And we've had dharnas, which most other cultures do not have. We've had a few of those. Why does protest take varying forms? This is a very important question, relating both to dissent and to other forms of protest, some of which may well be violent. Why is there an emphasis on non-violence in theory, in some theories, even when it is known that that was a time when violence was in practice? And yet the theories go on talking about non-violence. One needs to look at this in terms of why. Why is this happening? Why do we deny the presence of dissent in history? We today, what is it that we are afraid of? And this is why I brought up in the book a prominent form of dissent in the 20th century, that of satyagraha. I have tried to trace why it received such an impressive public response. Was it largely that it was just a familiar form? Was it largely because that it was conveying something new that the dissenters wanted? Shaheen Bagh, I've been there, talked to them as a historian, as a citizen. Very interesting in terms of the role that it plays in our society today. The Shaheen Bagh protest is a kind of continuation at one level of a demand for a dialogue, which is an essential factor and feature of the dissent that I've been talking of, expressed in a non-violent way. At another level, it is the articulation of a new category of protesters, women. This really hasn't happened before. And its acceptance by the kind of people that did accept it is again a new feature which we have to be aware of and we have to understand. I think, therefore, that the identity has to be much more than simply the identity of protest, because implicit in protest is, what are you protesting against? What role has that played in creating your society? Before you get onto the question of why you are protesting.
You also said that nationalism itself is a historical phase. And while Indian nationalism began as an anti colonial movement, how would you characterize Indian nationalism today?
Well, as a historian again, I would say that nationalism is a particular historical phase. First of all, let me emphasize and agree with the majority of historians who go on repeating that nationalism does not go back to pre-modern times. And I am tired of constantly hearing, oh, we were great nationalists in the ancient period. We weren't. There was no nationalism then. Nationalism is a product of modern times. And as a historian, I would argue that it is part of the foundational change in societies that takes place in modern times. Yes, the past continues, and one of the reasons why one studies the past is because it has a continuity, but at the same time, the present can often be a change, a total, an extremely important change that gives a new direction to society. And this is, in a sense, what the reason behind nationalism is doing. Part of the foundational change in societies that take on the ideology of nationalism is that it coincides with two things: the coming of capitalism and the emergence of the middle class. It reflects the middle class aspirations wishing to control political power, assert high status, and dominate the economy. This is a very specific period of history, and we cannot treat it as something that vaguely went back into past times. The nation state is replacing the state systems of earlier times. Most importantly, let me say that what is still not understood in India, and I think this is a very major problem, are that these foundational changes have to be understood as going beyond just the independence of the nation. Yes, we were fighting for independence. Nationalism, anti-colonial nationalism brought us independence. But there is a change that we have to be aware of and adjust to and understand. And what is that change? The basic unit of society today is the citizen. It is not the subject that was the basic unit in pre-modern times. Citizens have now replaced the subjects of old. And subject is a very loaded term because it means what it does, that you're subjected to. The citizen is an independent category. There are major differences between what was the subject and what is the citizen. And the citizen is characterized by important rights, the rights of the citizen guaranteed by the state and the obligations of the citizen. There is an elected government representing the citizens and protecting their rights. This is absolutely essential. The elected government has to protect the rights of the citizens. And the rights of the citizen in relation to the state are contracted and recorded often in the Constitution, which again, the government is expected to obey. The rights apply equally to all citizens with no exceptions. And nationalism is the ideology that links together territory, state, citizen, and is inclusive of all ideologies. Nationalism, therefore, includes every citizen with no qualifications demarcating one identity as being more appropriate than the other. This became an issue as early as the 1930s. Why? Because anti-colonial nationalism included every citizen, and a few others as well if they wish to join in. The opposite was religious nationalisms, the two, the Muslim and the Hindu. These were exclusive nationalisms to themselves, limited to members of particular religious communities. Now, this raised the very important issue of secularism. Only the inclusive nationalism, including everybody, could be secular, and was, and presumably is, to the extent that it still exists. Religious nationalisms, by their very definition, cannot be secular. So, when nationalism gives priority to any single identity, be it religious or be it language or be it ethnicity, on the basis of that being the majority in the country, then nationalism is replaced by what we call majoritarianism. And this negates democracy. So it's a very complicated process where the understanding of the citizen is fundamental. And what is called religious nationalism in India, with a priority in citizenship for the Hindu majority, is therefore criticized as not being nationalism.
I have another question that I put to you later. It is, can you address the idea of this? You know, we've seen these news and all these things coming out, and this one thing you see is this contempt, the notion of contempt of those in power against those who dissent. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, I think it is demonstrated. Those who are in power, irrespective of who they are contemptuous of those who are questioning them. And very often the dissent is dismissed by saying, oh, they're envious. They'd like to be in power. They're not in power. Therefore, they're questioning us. But let's not forget that being in power is an assertion not only of power, but of superiority, of a condemnation of people that you feel are questioning and attacking you or dissenting from you, and from whom you wish to maintain social distancing, not in the COVID sense, but in the literal sense of keeping them out and away from power and status and economic benefit. These are complex causes of dissent because contempt of those in power is a very complex state of mind, and we have to understand the complexities. Contempt can be something else, something quite different. And I'm not being Freudian here, I'm just trying to suggest an alternative explanation, a common sense explanation of why people use contempt. It is a disguise for fear as well. Contempt hides the fear that the powerful have of those who question their acquisition of power and who question the way in which the powerful are using their power. That whole process of questioning the way power has come to certain people and the way in which it is being used, which is dissent, is something that obviously frightens those that are in power. For example, there are, not just here but elsewhere, two political parties that have a long history of being marginalized, and then they acquire central focus in power. They fear those challenging their way of exercising power because Power to them is something relatively new. They do not distinguish between dissenters, protesters, terrorists, and anyone and everyone who questions them has to be silenced. There's a blanket silencing of anyone that asks questions. So all dissenters are accused of being terrorists, anti nationals, conspirators against the state. I have been accused of that through the textbooks that I wrote for middle schools. I was called an academic terrorist, as were other authors of those textbooks too. So, the fear that is caused by dissent among those in power is expressed not by opening up society and holding dialogues and saying, look, you don't have to be frightened, we will talk, let us talk, but rather by enforcing the controls of power. This is again something that happens in many societies, and one can recognize it right away. And implicit in this contempt is also another factor which is not given enough emphasis by people who analyze in the media and so on, the implicit anti-intellectualism that is necessary to have contempt for people who are dissenting. Because very often the dissent is thoughtful, it's considered, it's worked out, people are offering alternatives. None of this is given any attention to. It's all dismissed. And one can only say that it is anti-intellectualism. For example, when the police puts academics and lawyers into prison, as in recent cases, the educational shortcomings of those in authority are only too clear when you read the endless, seemingly endless charge sheets. It's as if you suddenly decide that everybody has to be picked up and everybody has to be charged with the same crimes, whether you can prove that they committed them or not. And this is really, it's contempt, but it's also a kind of inverted contempt, because it's also showing a weakness on the part of those who are actually being contemptuous.
You talk about this, you say this idea of coexistence is no longer sufficient for citizenship, that majoritarian identity is now being redefined as citizenship. Professor Thapar, I believe that the Hindutva project is already here. And the Hindutva project of recasting the ideal citizen as a subject by eroding citizenship rights and making the citizen wholly made of hate and bigotry is already here. At this very moment, what forms of dissent and protest do you see as possible?
Well, at this very moment, if one is looking for non-violent forms of dissent, one can only think of different categories of civil disobedience, as was thought of by the national leaders when they were confronting a similar situation. When dissent was not sufficient, non-violent dissent was not sufficient to make those in power talk and speak and discuss and be in dialogue with those who had questions. The alternative at that point was the demand by a number of nationalists that it should become a violent protest. That was prevented really again by actions such as satyagraha. Now, there are other ways also of doing this, which is civil disobedience is in many ways a much more dramatic way, but you have to think very carefully about what it is that you are going to organize. You cannot just go on a hunger strike in itself. That is not sufficient. But there has to be a very well thought out conditioning of what that dissent will produce and result in before you actually take to it. I mean, there are public agencies that can be examined much more closely, threatened, watched, made to perform their function. How, I don't know. I haven't really, quite frankly, thought of these issues because, in a sense, it's been a bit of a roller coaster, the way in which this whole project of Hindutva has arrived and has taken us all over. But things like the media, I think that we are not sufficiently analytical and forceful in objecting to the kinds of really disgraceful things that often happen on different kinds of media. I think this has to be done much more thoroughly. It is done by those who are doing these things. For example, the trolls on the other side are so active that many of us, we can hardly open our mouths before we start being abused. And the abuse is quite disgusting. Now, do we also have counter trolls? I don't know whether this is really of any use at all. But I do think that the kind of opposition, the kind of questioning, the kind of challenging that is necessary when the media is grossly unjust has to be much greater, much, much greater. The media, after all, is our media as much as anybody else's. And therefore, why allow it to become something that, one begins to treat with contempt and allow that? The second area, which is, of course, a very long-term area, but nevertheless, I think that some agitation there is necessary, is education. What the contents of education are going to be is something which is going to be another disaster, because the contents of education are to produce good citizens of a particular type, not the type that one thinks are really the kinds of citizens we want. So how are we going to in any way influence the content of education in order to make people aware of how sensitive and important this kind of activity is? It's not just arithmetic and writing and reading. It's not just that. It's, after all, creating a mind. It's creating a citizenship that, for example, will be asking questions. How do you ask questions? Children have to be taught that they have the right to question the world around them. And that, what is written in the textbook is not the end thing. It's not something that they have to absolutely agree with. They can ask questions. Reliable sources. Somebody gets up and makes a statement. The ordinary citizen should get up and say, what are your sources? How reliable are your sources for saying that? We don't. Causal connections that are made. Because A happened, B happened. These causal connections have to be logical. They cannot be arbitrary. They cannot be fantasy-based. Now, this is a long-term thing. But I think even though it's a long-term thing, it is something to which we have to give some attention, simply because it's going to be a continuous process. It's not going to be something that you do today. It's not an act of violence or an act of dissidence that you perform today and there is an outcome tomorrow. These are very long-term things. But I think these are things that we, in our 70 years of independence, have neglected. And it's about time that we started paying attention to them.
Professor Thapar, we are coming to the end of the conversation. I have one last question for you. And the last question I'm putting to a historian is looking towards the future. And I'm actually going to ask you a question that has preoccupied me for quite some time now, especially what's happened in the last few years, say the creation of the autonomous zones of Rojava in Syria, where the women were creating a new form of government. I'm almost convinced that the only way possible for us is to radically reimagine ideas. of how we constitute ourselves, ideas of citizenship, even ideas of what it means to be free today. Um, do you think that is possible, that we can now radically reimagine the idea of, say, the nation and the citizen? If so, how would we reimagine these ideas?
Well, I think we have no choice. We have to reimagine. Otherwise, we may as well just give up. It's all right for me. I can give up at my age. It doesn't matter a damn. But what about the young people? They have a whole future life before them. They can't give up. And so, again, as a historian, speaking as a historian, I would argue that we've tried, the world has tried all kinds of ways of reimagining society. Some have succeeded, some have failed miserably, some have done somersaults and gone back. I mean, you had a country that was very forward looking and very modern and gave up all kinds of religious codes because they were backward. And everybody said, oh, it's an Asian country, but it's great. It's very forward looking. And now it's the country that is the most backward looking because it's dropped all the modern values and ideas and gone back to things that really are not supportive of the world of today. Now, we have to understand that history does change. The whole point of writing history is to recognize the change and to explain why it changes. So if we're going to reimagine a new nation and a new citizen, we have to ask ourselves, how do we do it with the ingredients that we have at the moment? What are the ingredients that we have at the moment? We have people who still think of themselves as subjects of a government. They are not people who think of themselves as citizens. And I must go back to this. It's become a kind of chorus with me now. I'm even teased about it by my friends. That really the whole question of what is a citizen in a nation state is a question that we have to begin to teach the next generation, the younger generation. It is absolutely essential. What does this mean? I would like to see it as every country in the world post-pandemic having a foundational layer of the rights of citizens, a layer where the state and the government concerned, irrespective of what government it is, has to guarantee the rights of the citizen. Otherwise, sorry, it's not a government. If it's going to claim to be a government, it has to guarantee these rights. And what are these rights? At one level, I would say food, water, shelter, employment. Doesn't matter whether it's fancy employment or ordinary employment, but guaranteed employment. We've seen too many people in the last 6 months absolutely decimated, dying, and really brutally treated by the environment and what happened simply because they didn't have these essentials. Their employment was uncertain, and so they couldn't have it. So this is one level. Healthcare and education have to be available to everybody and compulsory. And then we come to the very important issues, a little further up the scale, as it were: equality of citizenship, freedom of speech, and social justice. Now, this is, in a sense, reordering our society. God knows today a society like ours is incapable of doing this unless it makes up its mind that this is actually what we want, and this is what we want those who govern us to do. We have to make that demand. It's not a violent demand. It is not a bloody revolution. It's not a brutal demand. It is a very simple, absolutely basic demand that the rights of citizenship have to be given, guaranteed, endorsed for every single person in this country. I think that that is absolutely, absolutely crucial. It will mean automatically, it will mean restructuring, radically restructuring the economy, restructuring attitudes of people. But the point is that it can be done over a couple of generations or so if there is a willingness to do it. My problem is, maybe it's because I'm too old now, my problem is that I don't see that willingness. What I see, unfortunately, is a society that consists of people who are not humane, who have very little compassion, who have very little concern for their fellow human beings. And it's one's own personal gain which is the most important thing. Hunger for power, hunger for position and status, which is all right up to a point, but only up to a point. Now, if this kind of ethical system has to be changed, as well as the physicalities of what citizen rights demand, it's a major change. It is, in its own way, a revolutionary change, even though it's not a violent, bloody revolution that one is calling for. Not at all. I don't think those have succeeded. We've seen them, we've been party to them, some of us. We've endorsed them up to a point and thought they would succeed. They haven't succeeded. So what we really want is something that will be radically different and will, in fact, give us the kind of society that has always emphasized ethical values, compassion, humanity. I think these are absolutely fundamental, provided everybody has the means to do so. It's not enough to feed ethics to people who have empty stomachs.
Professor Thapar, thank you so much for joining us today, and I can't think of a better way to end this conversation. I'm also going to take your words as actually a call for revolution. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's very nice of you to ask me.
And I read this book last week, preparing for this conversation, and I urge all of you to buy a copy and read it. You can pre-order the book at seagullbooks.org. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Professor.